Yesterday afternoon, I was talking about the relationship between psychedelic experiences and mystical experiences, and pointing out that there were really two major features in common. One, the sensation of polarity, of you as a subject, a knower, a center of action, get this astonishing experience of being inseparable from everything that you had hitherto defined as other than yourself. Because you understand that the sensation of self cannot be experienced except in relation to the sensation of something other. And therefore that there is something in common between everything experienced as other and everything experienced as self. It's as if there was sort of a conspiracy, like Tweedledum and Tweedledee agreeing to have a battle. And you see, and you have the vivid sensation of the motions and behaviors going on inside you, which are voluntary, being simply, as it were, the other face of all the motions and behaviors that go on, whether inside you or outside you, that are involuntary. As if they were two sides of the same coin, dancing together. And this is a very fascinating feeling, and a very good feeling, if you have there's something iffy about this, which I'll come back to. But a very good feeling, on the whole, because you feel that the whole arrangement of life, of the world, of the universe, is fundamentally harmonious. Even though you can understand that there are tragedies and agonies, nevertheless, for some peculiar reason, you see that those are, shall I say, bands on the spectrum of experience. The spectrum of experience is vast, is multidimensional. And that the energy of the world is playing on all parts of the spectrum. So it ranges, you see, on what we could call the pleasure-pain scale, from extremes of ecstasy to extremes of agony. Now, what we feel, you see, we always feel that the extreme of agony is threatening because it can bring about death. And we have been carefully trained to try to avoid experiences on the agony extreme of the band. When you were a little baby, and for example, you vomited, your mother may have reacted, ugh, you see? And that taught you that vomiting was not a pleasant sensation, although in fact it is. And when people got sick, your parents got anxious and said, oh, ooh, oh, and you learned to imitate those reactions. When people died, they started crying and had a funeral, and it was all very solemn. And so you learned that dying was a bad thing. But all these attributions of good and bad to the natural events of life are artificial. They are social conventions. They're a game being played. And when we play games, we take various elements, like, supposing you're playing poker and you've got chips. And you say, red chips worth so much, blue chips worth so much, white chips worth so much. And you put your valuation on the chips. So in exactly the same way, life is going on. And you put your valuations on it. Your parents put valuations on it because they were playing games with life. Competitions, who wins, who loses, etc., you see? And so they put all these values on them, and consequently these are so ingrained in everybody that they find it difficult to be liberated, to see everything in what Buddhists call its suchness. Now, suchness means this, and this is a very, very common feature of psychedelic experience. that you see that everything is simply a dance of energy. It isn't good, it isn't bad, but it is beyond good and bad, good with a capital G, that it's just great. It's a fantastic achievement. See, life. And it's going, there are all sorts of ways, you know, doing all these dances. And that's what it's all about. And therefore, in a certain sense, anything goes. And yet in another sense, it isn't just anything goes, because the fun of this whole thing is to make patterns, to figure out games, to do something with it. And it's doing this forever and ever and ever. And it's going to surprise itself because you know what a shock death is. You know, it just blows you right out. But if you observe the world, you see that it keeps coming back. So, for heaven's sakes, don't worry yourself with the images of being annihilated forever. You know, of being, as it were, buried alive in the dark, and to be confined in darkness for always and always and always, which would be just unbearable. Just forget it. That's a complete hallucination. After you're dead, you know, well, you'll be someone else, just as you are now. You know, you came into this world, came out of this world is a more correct way of saying it, and experienced yourself altogether new. Well, everybody who comes out of this world has the same experience, and it keeps happening. And when one of them is finished and feels itself disappear, then, as we know, another one starts. And that's you all over again. That's a difficult thing to understand, because most people are unaware of the reality of intervals, of spaces. And there are spaces, intervals, between all human lives. And those spaces join the lives together, whether they're spaces of what we ordinarily call space, or whether they're spaces of time, intervals of time. And you can understand this when you listen to music and realize that the melody that you hear is result of hearing the intervals between the tones. If you don't hear the intervals, you just hear a succession of noises and you don't hear melody at all. So in the same way, there are intervals between lives that join the lives together. And you don't have to imagine any strings attached, any soul spook transmigrating from one life to another. Lives to lives are joined simply by the interval between them. And to become aware of space in this way is the most important thing. Most people are completely unconscious of space and regard it as nothing. Then, so I said this then, is a major feature of psychedelic experience, which is in common with mystical experience, is then, we'll call it first, the sense of polarity, and of the games, the suchness of things, that life is simply what it is, that it has no absolute value, but you put your values on it, like you put values on the chips in poker. But actually, let's suppose let me give two illustrations of suchness. Let's say we consider the word yes, and that we mean by something that it's affirmative. But say yes several times. Yes, 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 Yes. And you begin to hear it as a noise. See? Yes. Isn't that funny? We make that noise. Yes. Yes. And suddenly the meaning evaporates from it and you get just the noise. So in exactly that way, you begin to look at everything. Or take another illustration. When somebody doesn't know about something and shrugs his shoulders. See? And you do it once and it has a meaning. But imagine you're watching someone going... you know? And suddenly you see everything is like that. It doesn't mean anything. But it's fascinating because it is just a certain play of pattern. Like you're fascinated when you look at a crystal. You like to turn it around, look at all the angles in the thing and all the patterns. Or pick up a seashell, pick up a fantastic rock, admire a fish. You see? And this way of looking at it, that it just... everything is a fantastic pattern. It has no meaning, except it's just what it is. Dancing like that. Did you ever see a lady go this way, go that way? That's what it is. And that's suchness. And then the second aspect is that you can often come to a level of experience where you get in touch with the final basic energy that is operating in all these patterns, diagrams, and games. And this is generally experienced as a sensation of intensely brilliant light. As if you realized the current inside your nerves and saw it as this brilliant light. If somebody hits you on the head hard, you see stars. See? Because then you suddenly experience the current inside the nerves. And with psychedelics, you very often come to an experience of absolutely vivid light. In accord with the physicist's realization that everything is really light. That this whole world is light throbbing in different vibrations, so that wherever we encounter something dark or something solid, it isn't actually against light, but it is a form of light that is going so fast in its wavelength that it affects us as the experience of density and impenetrability. If light is too bright, it smashes your eyes quite as effectively as somebody's fist can smash your face. So everything that we call density and impenetrability is not is really in effect strength of light. Now, these are the two features then of two principal features of psychedelic experiences which correspond with mystical experiences. Now, I want to talk particularly today about the aspect of danger in these things. Because you will see in what I have been saying so far, come over here, that there's a departure from common sense. For example, people say, oh, I want my life to be meaningful. I want it all to make sense. And therefore, when you propose the idea that life really doesn't make any sense at all, that it's just some kind of jazz going on, this is threatening to people. They say, is it after all a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury signifying nothing? But as R.H. Blythe said once, when commenting on this passage from Macbeth, it is said so well that it doesn't seem so bad after all. Maybe the whole thing is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury. But it's the sound and the fury that are important. You see? But that's an idea which we're not used to. We are taught to think that if your life doesn't have some purpose, you're a washout. You're just an idiot. But maybe it's a very good thing to be an idiot. To be a complete fool. And simply to sit and watch the waves. You know how good a thing it is to sit on a beach and just watch waves breaking and dissolving? You can sit for hours completely fascinated. And children like to do this, like to sit by a pond and drop pebbles into it and see all the concentric circles coming out of the plop. Why not? You could say, well, it's much more important to go into business and achieve some substantial results and raise a family. Why? You're just making a bigger splash, that's all. And you have children, and the children go blah, 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 diggy, 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 diggy. Finally, they go, when they started, blah, 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 you know, they make sense and they talk and so on. But it's all just a kind of jazz. I mean, raising families and businesses and getting food and eating and going on and going out this way and so on. You know, it's like hair growing or trees coming out and moving all over the place. But that's scary. If you've been brought up to think that it's supposed to mean something. When you see it doesn't, and that's just what's happening, a lot of people get frightened. They think they're going insane. And they wonder whether they can remember the rules. Well, now, in getting into this predicament, the most important thing to understand is the immense sanity-giving power of letting go and not trying to hold on to any sort of security. This is I think this is one of the most important things in life, to realize how powerful and how great in conferring order and sanity and a feeling of comfort on any conceivable situation it is to be able to let go. Now, there is a difference between this kind of relaxation and being merely limp, in the sense of when you hang a cloth over a clothesline, it is limp, it simply drops. And there's a subtle difference between being completely relaxed and being merely limp. You see, when you are, as a physical body, you're completely relaxed, you still have muscle tonus. You have a certain vibrancy going in you. You're not just a bunch of jello or kind of grease that if you relax you will just form a nasty blob and eventually slip through the floor. There is vivacity and strength. So in the same way, if you relax psychologically and completely let go of things, you will find that you have psychological tonus, energy. And you cannot really do anything skillfully. Any art, you can't talk, you can't think, you can't have sexual orgasms or anything like that, unless you have learned fundamental relaxation. So when in the midst of some sort of psychedelic experience, whether you're using LSD or whatever, or whether you have an experience that comes upon you spontaneously. And you get scared that you're going to go out of your mind, you're going to lose control, you're not going to be in charge anymore. You do exactly what you do if you find yourself in a typhoon at sea. When you find yourself in a typhoon, what they do is they turn off the engines. Because in a big steamship, if the propellers get swung out of the water and turn on their own, they shatter the ship by vibration. So they turn off the engines and drift. Of course, they keep an eye on how near to land they are, but they try to get as far from land as possible. And just drift. In the same way, if you're in a sandstorm in the desert, there's absolutely nothing you can do. So the Arab, he wears a wool burnous, and he crouches down on the ground like a fetus in the womb and simply covers himself with his burnous and doesn't move until the sandstorm is over. And you know Edgar Allan Poe's story about the vortex, about the man who gets into the middle of the thing, where the calm center is. I had a friend in London years ago who was a psychiatrist, and a very wise one, and he wanted to see a royal procession celebrating the King's Jubilee or something. But he wasn't going to walk out onto the street at 4 o'clock in the morning and wait so as to get a front seat. He came just a few minutes before the procession started. Here was this milling crowd of people pushing and shoving and so on. He just leant on the back of the crowd, did nothing else but lean. And in all the jostling, he leant and really found himself in the front row. So when any kind of terror starts, and you begin to feel uncomfortable and uneasy, you just let go. Now, why does it work? It works for exactly the same reason that you got born. You had nothing to do with it, from the conscious point of view. All this remarkable brain and bones and everything came into being. Even your father and mother didn't understand really how it happened. They knew they had to do certain formalities to get the thing started. But really how it all works, nobody understands. But it does it of itself. That's why the Chinese call nature Ziran, which means of itself so, spontaneity. And this extraordinary organization of intelligence happened. And we are afraid of it because it is scary from the point of view of individual consciousness. As the psalmist says, "The Lord, I am fearfully and wonderfully made." And that means I'm scary to myself. And so we think that we know better and that we ought to make certain corrections to nature so that it will function more desirably. But that's quite doubtful, whether we really ought to do that. It might have been better to leave it all alone, as the great Taoist sages of China had always advised, is leave life alone. They say the first man who trained horses was called Polo. So we get the name of the game of polo from him, and that he ruined the nature of horses by doing this. We could say, too, that by our technology, we really made an awful mess of things. Perhaps, you see, of course, we're stuck with it. That's the nature of karma. Once you've interfered, you're stuck with it. You've got to see it through. But it could be argued, quite persuasively, that we never should have done anything like that. That we should have followed our feeling and just let life happen. And then, of course, we wouldn't have any of the problems we have now in terms of atom bombs, population bombs, all these problems, you see, would not have occurred. Only, from the standpoint of civilized people, we should say of human beings in that state, well, they're just barbarians. They do what they feel like. And from our standpoint, that is not very pretty, because we've got a special concept of what it is to be very pretty, which is all stuck about with ding-dongs and clothes and bells and whatever, houses. But the fish, the cats, the birds live with their curious dignity, and they make no, you remember Jesus? When he said, consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. And I've never yet heard a sermon on that passage where the preacher commended it. They all say, well, that's a great life, but of course, for all practical purposes, it's impossible. The most subversive passage in the New Testament. Be not anxious for the morrow. Let it take care of itself. Drift. Be like a leaf on the wind. I remember when I had my very first mystical experience. I was 17 years old. And I was in a great state of tension, trying to find out something. And suddenly I abandoned the whole thing. And whoops, it flipped your inside. And I felt like I was a leaf on the wind. It happened to be at the time of year, it was autumn, and there were many dry leaves floating around and skittering about, how leaves play like they're little children let out of school. They go along the street with the wind. And I felt exactly like that, as if I didn't own anything, didn't have any responsibilities, didn't care whether it went this way or whether it went that. I was completely released. And I felt completely one with a leaf being blown by a wind, and I was the wind and I was the leaf. And this wind was the wind that bloweth where it listeth, that Jesus uses as an analogy of the Spirit. You know what listeth means? It blows where it likes. Not where you hear. It's nothing to do with listen. Old English listeth means it blows where it wills. And in other words, at random. And to let go in that sense, and allow and really consider the possibility that everything in life is completely out of control and at random, but go with it. This is fundamental to any kind of strength, any kind of real control. So that what happens in a psychedelic experience is that when it is valuable for the reason that it can be a very threatening experience. It can suddenly show you that you're not really in control, that anything might happen. And this, I think, in a way, is the center of the whole thing. Why these sort of drugs are effective is that they throw you off your normal functioning. And this is why there are a whole complex of drugs that are quite different but act in the same general way. What they do is they throw you off. As I said, I think, earlier in this seminar, they give you a sense of something queer. Change your state of consciousness so that by contrast with your habitual way of feeling things, you say, I feel odd. Now, it may be odd good and it may be odd bad, but you feel odd. It's as if everything, the whole sensorium, your whole consciousness, has had a change in it. And you can't really figure out what it is, because it's common to every particular sense impression, to seeing, to hearing, to white, to blue, to red. Everything has been subtly altered, as if it were buzzing, as if it were at a strange angle, as if it had become luminous, as if it were suddenly transparent, as if it were squirming a bit. And because this is common to everything, you say, this is queer. So you suddenly are out of control. Things aren't ordinarily what they should be. And of course the same thing can happen in sickness. Some people, when they're dying, have the sense that everything is completely wrong. It's all out of order. It's weirdly out of order. Now, these then are opportunities to let go. Give it up. Don't try to control anything. And as soon as you are really persuaded by some kind of event to do that, like the person caught in the typhoon, or the sandstorm, or people who are dying, anybody in extremis will recognize that he just has to give up. There's nothing else to do. And when you do that, you suddenly discover you have enormous reserves of strength, intelligence, and power, if you let go. But you see, common sense militates against this. They say, well, if you let go, you'll just become a slob. You'll just become nothing at all, and you will be sucked down the drain. But it isn't true. It's only by complete letting go that you have a source of strength, which bounces right back at you. So then, when people get the horrors and the terrors in using, say, LSD, they're so apt to panic and go running off to a doctor, or turn themselves in at a hospital and say, please, 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 I'm lost in the corridors of my mind. I've been chased down some endless passage and I can't find my way back. Help, 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 I'm lost. And then, of course, because if a psychiatrist doesn't know what to do and thinks this person is really in a very serious condition, he gets anxious. And his anxiety instantly communicates itself to the patient, who gets more anxious. And they come around and they look official and they give medications and this, that, and the other. And the person is completely spooked. So a good psychiatrist, in handling a thing like this, just treats it as if it were the most normal everyday occurrence. People think they're going to die. People think they are about to lose the power to breathe, that their hearts are going to stop, that their brains are going to dissolve into some kind of drip, and feel all those sort of sensations. But all those sensations, you see, of being out of control are the sensation of the dissolution of the ego. That's what's happening. That ego is what Jung once called a cramp in consciousness. And in Sanskrit there's a word, sankocha, which means essentially contraction. And the Jivatman, the ego, is a sankocha. And do you often feel, if you experience yourself organically, thoroughly, that you're contracted? Can you feel a constant strain in yourself? It centers right between the eyes, here. And Trigant Barreau made experiments with electroencephalographs and things to see what was the difference between the state of a person who had a cramp here and the person who relaxed it. But it's not only here, you feel it all over you. If you become aware that through all the day long you are in a state of defensiveness, you're tightening where you needn't tighten. And a lot of people experience it here, and as a result generate ulcers. Well, there are all sorts of places where we feel this tightening, holding on. Now, it doesn't do any good. Because I can't tell anyone, you should relax. Because that's a sort of double bind. Because the moment you say should, you inculcate a state of mind which is unrelaxed. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God. Here, you better watch out if you don't. Well, you can't love on that basis. You can't love because you know that you ought to love in self-defense. It's impossible. Love is something not under any ego control at all. You have to let go to let love happen. Maybe it will, maybe it won't, but that's none of your business. So, it's very, very frequent in psychedelic experiences that people become vividly aware of how tense they are, defending themselves against everything all the time. On the watch out. See? But almost all the energy we expend in doing that kind of thing is waste. So that if you stop doing it, because you see that the only way to stop doing it is you can't will yourself to stop doing it. You can only realize that it's completely useless. That it doesn't achieve anything at all. It just wears you out. It's absolutely no good. It's like having a sense of guilt. It is an entirely destructive emotion that doesn't do anything for anyone. There are a lot of existentialists today who say that unless you feel A, anxious, and B, guilty, you're not living a genuine existence. Imagine that. You know, you're not authentic. Because if you're a real human being, you know that if you exist, you might not exist. And therefore you tremble, to be or not to be. And if you're a human being, you know that you're not really up to what you might be. Therefore you feel guilty, because you're a little defective. And all this is posturing. It's a great pose. As people say, to be real, you've got to be, you know? Yeah, that's all play acting. It's just a joke. Yes, I'm deeply sincere, you know. Yes, I'm terribly sincere. I really mean this. You know, do I really mean to exist? To be here as an organism? I mean, good Lord, I am here, you know. And, well, I can't help it. It has nothing to do with my ego that I have feet and that I exist and that I'm here. Do I really mean it or don't I? Well, I guess I do. I mean, my physical existence here is perfectly sincere. It's about as real as anything can be. But I didn't intend it. I don't have to say, you know. I mean, if somebody threatens me, then I may bounce back rather strongly. But I don't have to make a sort of cause out of it. So, the notion that I ought to feel anxious all the time, and that I ought to feel guilty all the time, is simply a way of people who that really don't have a very good sense of existence, and they drum something up like lying on a bed of nails, because that makes you feel more real, because it hurts. It's a kind of masochism. Well, you can do that if you want to. There's really no reason why you shouldn't, except that I think it's a sort of a drag. So, the point being, the people who say, well, you should lie on a bed of nails, and feel that makes you feel important. You've done something that most people don't do, and you're a bit far out, and therefore perhaps you're more real. I say, okay, but just please have a sense of humor about what you're doing. Don't take it quite that seriously. Try to convert everybody else to sleeping on beds of nails, because it's not to everybody's taste. And but a lot of people, you see, who sleep on beds of nails, just because they're very insecure, because they feel that unless they suffer, there's something awful going to happen. They try to convert everybody else to doing the same thing. See, that's one way of finding out that knowing that you're right, is to get as many people as possible to agree with you. Like the Bandalog, the monkeys in Kipling's story in the Jungle Book, who keep exclaiming, we all say so, so it must be true. And to feel guilty and to feel anxious and then make a religion out of it and say, this is the way any authentic human being feels. And if you don't, there's something wrong with you. You know, like a lot of people who are being psychoanalyzed feel that anybody who is not being psychoanalyzed is neurotic. As Philip Reeve puts it in his book on Freud, The Mind of the Moralist, he says the characteristic institution of our era is not the parliament but the hospital. That everybody is being undergoing therapy. Everybody must admit that they are in the course of being cured, but is not cured. Nobody can claim, anybody who got up and say, I am perfectly psychoanalyzed, I have no further problems, would be regarded in this day and age as someone who would, in a former age, get up and say, I'm absolutely holy, I'm a perfect saint. And that is immediately spiritual pride. You can't possibly claim that. All saints are measured as saints by the degree to which they declare themselves to be sinners. My sins are worse than your sins. I'm more sorry for my sins than you are. You can see then from the point of view that these chemicals give, you become aware of all these intricate games that people are playing. I remember once, long ago, Dano and I had a wonderful psychedelic session in which we were listening to the radio on a Sunday evening. And all these preachers were coming on with their messages. And the only one that rang true was a Negro revivalist. And he was stopping to make any sense at all. He was saying, the gift of the Lord is for everybody. I tell you, you got the Holy Spirit. And the whole congregation was saying, we hear you, baby. Amen. We hear you, baby. And, you know, if he got that far, they shut him off. And changed the program. But that was all right. Then there was a poor little man who was talking in an echo chamber. So it sounded like a great, great cathedral. And he played records of hymns, and then he came on with this Bible message, you know. And he kept saying, if you want a copy of this message, be sure to send in $1 to the station. Be sure to enclose your dollar. And we listened to that and thought, oh dear, isn't that grubby? But then you listen down into this voice saying that be sure to send in your dollar. And you realize this is a poor little creature saying, well, I've got to make a living somehow too. And in that voice, that awful corny voice saying, be sure to send in your dog, you hear a crying child, or you hear a lost animal calling out, please help, Mama, I want help. And you listen down into that, and you go further, listening to the sound. And finally, the human voice becomes like breath going through a flute. You know? And you think at first it's sad. And after a while you realize it isn't. It's just one of the ways things happen. It's the fundamental sound, it's the Om, it's the voice of God, playing a particular tune. And you think, marvel of marvels, you heard the divine sound through the throat of a Baptist preacher. Incredible. So, you know, that's one of the really great things about this kind of experience. You can tackle, you can confront things that in the ordinary state of consciousness you think were downright awful, and learn to understand them, why they're there. You can take people that you thoroughly disapprove of, and you can begin to understand why they are the way they are. For example, from my point of view, I've always been an argumentative person because I liked discussions and talking about philosophy and religion and so on, but I won't argue about anybody's religion anymore. I regard all the different opinions as so many different flowers in a garden. And they need each other. In other words, if somebody disagrees with me, then I know where I stand. If I said there wasn't somebody who disagreed with me, I wouldn't know where I stood. And so I have to thank him for pointing out to me what I think. And say, keep it up, that's great. We're all, you see, by our differentiations of point of view, making up a great pattern which you could call the intellectual life. It depends on that. But the basic point that I want to make in all this, what I am then really talking about is how, through the use of the psychedelic chemicals, you can be so shocked, you can be so disturbed, that you will learn that you've got nothing else to do but completely relax your controller, your censor, your ego. And that to the degree that you really let go and don't try to hold on to life anymore, you become enormously strong and able actually to control things. But all fundamental control depends on giving up control. And this paradox, which scares the hell out of us, is the main lesson of the whole thing. Now, the final problem that comes up in this discussion is what we might call psychedelic control. The whole question of, since there is a widespread circulation and knowledge of these substances among us, what are we going to do about it? I want to make the initial point that there is a very strong difference between controlling something and suppressing it. If you are controlled, to go back to the great General Motors image of life, if you are controlled as a driver of a car, that is quite different from a person who never drives. Keeps the car locked up in the garage. If you are controlled as a writer, you are not a person who never picks up a pen. If you're controlled as a dancer, you're not a person who never dances. But this has been utterly misunderstood throughout the whole history of the Christian West. And in the United States, we just haven't learned from any of the historical lessons. I recently was discussing this problem with an Indian tribe, and a tribe which incorporates the Native American church, where they use peyote in a religious ceremonial. And the significant thing about this particular order is that the peyote Indians are exemplary in their tribes as stabilizers. They are stable in their families, in their work, and they don't drink alcohol, which for some reason is extremely demoralizing to Indians. And they're very much against it. They won't allow it on the reservation at all, because they can't take it. It may be a question whether we don't have the same predicament in reverse. Can we take peyote and stay sane? We're used to alcohol, but it doesn't help us to be particularly sane. It does something for us, I guess. But the peyote Indians are really exemplary. They're wonderful people. And the peyote ceremony is absolutely marvelous, although it's quite a test of endurance. People who practice Zen talk about the session, where you sit in Zazen practice for a couple of hours maybe. But in the peyote ceremony you sit all night, from sunset to dawn, and you hardly move except once at midnight, when you get a drink of water passed round. And you can go out for the John if you want to. They say, because their religion is legal, there have been court tests of it. And but their view is that peyote, being a natural plant, is God-given, and the government has no right whatsoever to interfere with it. They would say, for example, that if the growth and distribution of peyote were under government regulation, and they were given the special privilege of being able to use it because they're a church, they would still protest and say this is not the business of any government whatsoever, because it grows, and all things that grow and all things that are natural are essentially good. And in this they concur with the Hebrew view of things, because in the book of Genesis it is explained that God created all things whatsoever, and only of all things the tree of knowledge was forbidden. Of course, it's always a problem of why it was there at all. But it says every herb and every plant is given for the good of man. And the Hebrew insists that, in other words, the material world, because it's the creation of God, is a good world, and that evil can only arise through the misuse of natural things. So they very strongly, the Indians contest the interference of government in the use or possession of any natural plant or herb whatsoever. And so naturally then, in this case, under this category, there come three of the major psychedelics, and actually there are more, but the three that are best known are peyote, the cactus, the mushroom Psilocybe mexicana, and the hemp plant, from which we get marijuana. I suppose you would also say tobacco. Incidentally, We don't smoke real tobacco. We smoke treated tobacco. The Indians smoke real tobacco, and they mix it with willow bark. It's rather a different scene. So, when it comes, however, to LSD and to dimethyltryptamine and synthesized drugs, there might be some cause for dispute about this. Just as there would be if we completely freely circulated penicillin or barbiturates, opiates, and strong-acting drugs of that description, we might say, yes, there is some good cause for imposing rather strict controls on the actual possession or purchase of these substances, just as there is an obvious reason for controlling the purchase of dynamite or TNT, or licensing people to own guns, drive cars, and so on. But you'll notice there is no law prohibiting the growing or possession of Amanita pantherina. Amanita pantherina is a mushroom that looks very like edible mushrooms and is deadly poison. There is no really effective antidote to it, but it's not forbidden by law. There is no law against growing belladonna, deadly nightshade. So the whole nature of a law against especially the possession of something that grows naturally on God's green earth has a certain degree of insanity about it. Because there are many points of view from which this can be considered. First of all, anyone can use a gun to kill a person, or you can just use it for plinking and shooting tin cans. It is not the possession of a gun which is criminal, it is the misuse of a gun, as it is also with the misuse of an automobile. And therefore the very nature of crime consists in a specific action which misuses some substance to the detriment of other people. When you make a law in which the possession of a given substance is a felony, you thereby invite endless corruption and problems. Let's consider first of all the problem of marijuana. It's very easy indeed to prove that someone possesses marijuana. All you have to do is sprinkle a little dust of the substance on somebody's coat, and then you can declare to the police that you have reason to believe that they possess marijuana, and they can vacuum clean your coat and find some small dust of marijuana there, and you can be put in jail for 5 years. In some states you could even be put to death, although this hasn't happened in quite a while. In other words, if you have a political rival and you want to get rid of him, you just plant some marijuana on his premises and tip off the police. If you have a wife you want to get rid of, if you have an enemy of any description, this is what you do. And in turn, if the government wants to get rid of you because they don't like your politics, they can just send the police around with a search warrant to your home, and they will carry in their pockets a few roaches, which are the butts of marijuana cigarettes, and just find it in something that you have. So you see, a law against possession is completely insane, because it invites all those sorts of possibilities. In the case, like when Al Capone was giving trouble, they couldn't get at him directly for any of his crimes, so they found an error in his income tax. Well, it's so much easier to find someone guilty of possessing marijuana. And the penalties for possessing it are worse and higher than those for fudging your income tax or for armed robbery. All sorts of quite desperate crimes are punished less heavily than possessing and especially pushing or selling marijuana. And so far as this particular herb, which is what it is concerned, the laws about it are based on pure superstition. There is not one single reputable scientific study of any description whatsoever that can prove a link between the use of marijuana and crime and insanity. There is no proof whatsoever that it leads inevitably to the use of heavy stuff like heroin. It is all worked up by Mr. Anslinger, who used to be head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. His history is rather interesting because before that time he was a great prohibition enforcer, and the law put him out of a job and he had to find a new job. So he worked up the myth that marijuana was a very dangerous drug and got himself made a head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. And he's worked all over the world. He's got it written into international treaties. And an enormous amount of nonsense has sprung up around this. Now, the British government, back at the end of the last century, realized that marijuana was in extensive use in India. And they had to decide what to do about it, and they made a very, very extensive investigation and published its results in several volumes and concluded not to take any steps against it in India. The United States Surgeon General investigated its use in Panama, and they decided that there was no point taking any action. From their standpoint, they found nothing particularly wrong with it. And when Mayor LaGuardia was in charge of New York, he had the New York Academy of Medicine make a very thorough investigation of its use, and their report was that they saw no particular harm in it, and at most it could be called a social nuisance. So, but for some reason the AMA, the American Medical Association, condemned the New York Academy of Medicine for a premature judgment and an unscientific investigation, but you know what lies behind that. One of the difficulties of the whole situation is that the use of marijuana is a substitute for alcohol. And alcohol is big business. So are cigarettes. And there's a fear among producers of alcohol that if people got onto marijuana, they wouldn't drink so much. And so they have a slush fund, a quite considerable sum, which they spend keeping up the notion that marijuana is very destructive. Also, it's very easy to grow. And although I don't think that if it were legal, many people would bother to grow it and prepare, because there's quite a problem involved of cleaning it and getting out stalks and seeds and all that crud. I don't think most people would bother, so that the tobacco companies could very well switch crops. Be quite easy. In fact, much cheaper than growing tobacco. And they could supply marijuana cigarettes in beautiful packages with all kinds of psychedelic colors on them and wonderful brand names, and make a terrific business out of it, as well as the excise tax that would naturally be imposed on it could finance a whole new war.
There's nobody left to fight.
But one must face the fact that in the free use of marijuana, there are certain dangers. But perhaps not such great dangers as are involved in the free use of alcohol. But I would want to say there a clear warning that there are varieties of marijuana which are extremely strong, especially in the form known as hashish, which is simply marijuana resin concentrated, which, if it were commonly used, we should run into certain social problems. And I'm going to deal with this first and then later with LSD, because the situations are rather different. The social problems that we could run into are that people who are under a very strong marijuana influence often don't know where they are, can easily get lost and confused. They are not liable to be violent unless there is some completely separate predisposing reason for them to be violent. It does not of itself make people violent. On the contrary, it makes them quiet, pacific, and slowed down. But you could get very confused. You might also get paranoid, over-fearful. And you might also become, in a certain sense, irresponsible, because one of the characteristics of marijuana is wonderfully described in a story. I forget at the moment its exact origin, but it's about a Negro and a young white boy who are close friends. The Negro is a hand on the farm owned by the boy's father. And one day the Negro explains marijuana to the boy. And he says that it makes everything transparent. You see right through everything. Not in the literal sense that it becomes like glass. That's a metaphorical sense. But that you understand what people are up to, what the game is, and you get to laughing. It induces a certain kind of what I would call loving cynicism, where you see the schemes, the ego-inflating and promoting tricks that everybody's up to. And you see the unimportance of a great deal of activity that human beings consider to be extremely important. In the case of almost all psychedelics, this is true. Because what happens is you suddenly slow down. And you realize that this moment is really worth living. And in fact, it's the important thing. What's going on? And you look around you, and you see people going about their everyday business, and they all look frantic. They're quite insane. Rushing off in cars and driving and getting there and making it on time and delivering that stuff and so on and so forth. You think, what on earth's the matter with them? And in this respect, you get into a state of feeling which, quite apart from anything to do with drugs, is the normal state of feeling for, say, an Indian. That's why in the United States we can't understand the Indians and never have got on with them. And all our best efforts to do something good for them are always futile. Because, for example, we want them to have big factories, better pay, and but go and live in Los Angeles. Well, they don't want to live in Los Angeles. They say we're quite mad because we work, our men work for days at some frantic job so they can take a little time off to go fishing or hunting. Well, they say we're there already. We've arrived. We fish, we hunt, and we're happy with that. Indians live in a kind of present which involves both the past and the future. But they don't have our idea of time as a clockwork thing, tick, 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 which you keep up with. Indians value time in a very special way. For example, when they have a meeting on some important question for the tribe, they'll come and for 4 hours or so they'll sit and just talk. And at the end, for reasons that the white man can't understand, they've come to a decision. Because they say, time made the decision. You know, you ask them, what do you think about so-and-so? What would you like to do? And they won't give you a direct answer. Because it's not the time for the answer. They believe that if you wait around and let it cook, time itself will deliver the decision. And we think that's terrible. That it's improvident. That it's, if you don't make up your mind now. See? Decide now. You can't. And I've always known this. And have constantly run into trouble because I would put off decisions. Because I knew that the moment for it wasn't right. That when things developed in a certain way, I would know what to do. So, under the influence of these substances, one does intend a little bit to become a sort of Indian. And as they say, the only good Indians are dead Indians. It's that whole attitude, you see, to nature, and that absence of the competitive spirit, which is in Indians, that the white Protestants strongly disapprove of. White Catholics too. American Catholics are Protestants, crypto-Protestants. And so there would be the problem, from the point of view of our culture, that if the use of marijuana was widespread, people would get a bit mañana in their attitudes to things and say, oh, let it wait. We're busy. What's the point? And there might be, therefore, a lack of pep and push and ginger. There's a little poem by H.V. Morton, thought that troubled a businessman during a sleepless night, supposing that St. Peter at the door finds pep and push and ginger all a bore. Well now, in that sense then, I think a widespread use of marijuana, especially if people started using it almost as frequently as they use tobacco, would result in a lot of extremely lazy people lounging around. Although I would say it would be stupid to use it as frequently as one uses tobacco, because you would lose the benefit of it. It would be something to be used, well, I would say certainly not more than twice in a day, because it has a certain sacramental quality to it. In other words, while you do a job and smoke a cigarette, and forget that you've got a cigarette, and you can to a certain extent drink and do something else, But if you're smoking marijuana, you shouldn't do anything else at all. You should really, like you would sit down to do justice to a marvelous dinner, and you should eat, and not try to smoke while you're eating or watch television. You should really do justice to the dinner, and so in the same way, if you use marijuana, you should really do justice to it, and be quiet. Yes, by all means listen to music, etc., etc. But don't do anything that will distract from that state of consciousness. Like, don't drive a car while you're playing the violin. Now, this leads me to think that there is a good reason why a substance of this kind should be rather difficult to get. The Japanese have an idea about views, a lovely view. You should not have a lovely view too easily visible. You should make a little bit of effort to go to the place where the beautiful view is. Because then you won't just take it for granted. You really devote yourself to it. And so I don't know that if marijuana was what is the best way of controlling it, as distinct from suppressing it, and making it a little bit difficult to come by. Either you make it expensive, or you make it necessary to grow your own and illegal to sell it or to market it. That could be a possibility, but you could be perfectly free to grow your own and take care of it and cure it and do everything that has to be done. But if it is as easily come by as a package of cigarettes, I have a feeling that it might in some ways lose its effect. You see, when you go back into history, you will find all kinds of documentation for similar outcries and fears about tea, about coffee, about tomatoes, and of course about tobacco. All sorts of tracts were written, say that tomatoes. They were very suspicious. And as for tea, why, tea was terribly expensive when it first came on the market in the West. And Dr. Samuel Johnson was a tea addict. And her society hostesses were embarrassed when he came because he drank such immoderate quantities of tea, and he was a very expensive guest. All these things have been looked on with immense suspicion. And, of course, they're all relatively harmless, especially tomatoes. And but this sort of superstition keeps running. Now, I suppose that when tomatoes were suspect, people really sat down to eat a tomato. Oh, gee, we've got this dangerous fruit. It's fantastic stuff. And so when they ate a tomato, they made it a big thing. And so the tomato tasted gorgeous, simply because it was valued. Now, in exactly the same way, when we say we've got some pot, this is great stuff, terribly illegal. So let's not trifle with this. Let's really sit down and enjoy this situation, you see? Well, that adds an enormous amount of value to the effect that it has. Now, I'm not saying that it's all psychological and there's nothing to do with the chemistry, but it's always mixed. We are psychosomatic beings. And therefore, the expectation, the setting in which one does anything like this is of great consequence. It's just the same, say, with wine. When you get one of those gorgeous French wines, and you've got this bottle and the special label, and it's that year, people sit and drink. And, it's marvelous. But actually, very few people can tell the difference, if they're blindfolded, between a cheap Pétri wine and a fine French wine. Yes, naturally, the person who is an expert on wines would know blindfold what he had. But the game of guessing wines is tricky, and most people can't tell. But the build-up, you see, if the thing has got the build-up and it comes in the right-looking bottle, and so on, then you have a marvelous time. So, if marijuana does indeed have beneficial effects, and to a certain degree it emphatically does, I mean, it is the most perfect tranquilizer of all of them. You can forget Librium and things like that, Miltown. They have nothing of the effect of marijuana. It will get people off alcoholism. I know a doctor who is he's a very respectable doctor, and he is fighting mad because he can't prescribe marijuana to his patients. And he is deluged with alcoholics and doesn't know what to do about them. And he's a pillar of society. He's a president of a county medical association and all that jazz. So it is unquestionably a healing herb, But like everything good in the world, it has to be used judiciously. And so there would be a danger. With very cheap, enormous supplies of marijuana, the people out of their minds would just smoke and smoke and smoke to be in the groove or for some reason of that kind, and it could be troublesome. But obviously, the solution to that particular problem is simply, primarily, to see the total unreason of any law prohibiting possession. If anybody wants to have their own plants and grow it and use it, there is no conceivable legal reason why they shouldn't. Selling is another matter. That should obviously be subject to some sort of regulation. It might be a tax regulation that makes the price high, or whatever. But I'm not going to. I mean, that's a question that shouldn't be decided until after very careful discussion. But the idea that it's a killer drug or a sort of a demon thing is pure superstition, and a rather malicious superstition at that. And you realize that for this really perfectly harmless activity as compared with smoking tobacco or drinking, there are 1,500 people in jail on fairly long terms in the state of California alone right now. And God only knows how many throughout the country at your expense. Now, when it comes to the problems of the more strong psychedelics like LSD, the problem becomes trickier. Because LSD can be so disorienting to many people and so terrifying that it is not wise to use it without the right sort of preparation and help. But of course, for that very reason, it's exciting. When I was giving a lecture some time ago on some subject not directly connected with these psychedelics at all, at a private high school, rather posh school, immediately the lecture was over, I invited questions, and all the questions were about LSD. So I said to these boys, I've given you a lecture on the Chinese philosophy of nature, and you asked me about LSD. What's the reason for this? Well, they sort of went into a hassle with each other and a little talk, or went to huddle with each other and a little talk. And they said, well, we think that our parents and grandparents did a pretty good job exploring the external world and learning how to control it. We would like to explore the internal world. And furthermore, because it's forbidden, it's that much more interesting. So there is a challenge here, and young people are always out for adventures. They wouldn't be young people if they weren't. And one reason why we have so much trouble with young people is that we coddle them. We make too much safety. Other people don't coddle their young like that. In Japan, for example, children have an enormous amount, little children especially, enormous amount of liberty in dimensions in which we don't have liberty. For example, I was going along the edge of a river or canal in Matsue, and about 20 feet above the canal there's a water pipe crossing the canal on a few concrete supports. And a small boy was crawling across it, having a wonderful time. Very dangerous. We would have a fit. We would build a fence all along the thing. And we would have, like at schools, wherever there's a school entrance, there are policemen with stop signs, and the children are herded across so that they won't be knocked down by cars. Children are even escorted in groups to and from school. In Japan, you'll see a little thing this high with a little yellow hat on and a knapsack on its back going tick, 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 down a crowded street
bicycles, taxis, cars going every which way in mad confusion. This little thing is going along all by itself. I remember Felix Green once told me that he gave a lecture at a high school, and there was a great banner over the auditorium, over the proscenium arch, in white letters on red, said, "Safety first in all things." You know, well, that's a way to die. Death is safe. You can't get into trouble if you're dead. Also, if you go into solitary confinement, it will be rather difficult to get into trouble. So stay home and be safe. Although there are more accidents in homes than in any other place. So we must realize in our attitude to children that while, yes, you advise your children about streets and cars and things like that, there is no such thing as safety. There never was in life, and there never will be. And unless you take that as your first premise in living, nothing will happen. You must be insecure. There isn't any security. Nevertheless, you can't just say, all right, no restrictions, no controls on anything. Because then people could obviously go out and buy tons of dynamite or private tanks and machine guns, mortars, howitzers, and whatever. You know, there are a lot of men who would love to own a howitzer and have a terrific crash with a shell every morning to go out in the middle of the bay and watch it blow up. So something has to be done. I would say when it comes to LSD then, that we've really got a dragon by the tail in this particular chemical. Although I think that it's a primitive chemical. That is to say that it's very unpredictable in its results. And I'm quite sure that if research is pursued, we'll be able to get something that is much more easy to handle than LSD, but as effective in a creative way. But you see, there isn't that research really being done, except by illicit graduate chemistry students who are working out all sorts of things, alternatives to LSD, so as to beat the law against its possession. Now, a law against the possession of LSD, whatever its wisdom, is completely unenforceable, for the simple reason that you can disguise LSD as anything in the world. You can, for example, get a solution of LSD in alcohol, and you can put a piece of Kleenex into it, and then pull the Kleenex out and let it dry. Then you've got a filthy old piece of Kleenex you jam into your pocket that might be something you blew your nose on. And all you have to do is take it out, drop it again in alcohol, soak it out, and there is the stuff. You can disguise it as peanut butter, fingernail polish, just anything at all, cookies, and chemically, in a smallish quantity, say of a few hundred micrograms, it's very, very difficult to detect. And you'd really have to know, in other words, if you suspected that a given person who was wearing nothing but a suit, you would have to analyze everything on him to find out whether there was any LSD present. It's simply unenforceable unless you're tipped off, unless you know in advance that the person has it in such a place. But you could smuggle interstate, into the country, vast quantities, because the basic dose that will, as they say, turn a person on is as low as 50 micrograms. A microgram is a millionth of a gram. So, therefore, the only solution in all these problems is the solution of facing facts, that is to say, of bringing everything out into the open. You cannot abolish the problem. In fact, as you try to do so, you will only intensify it. That's always been true, because if you prohibit something like this, well, of course, everybody will want it. Forbidden fruit is sweet. And therefore, there is always an organization to take care of the supply of prohibited things. Whether it's whores or possibilities for gambling, there is an organization of criminals who will undertake to do so. But the trouble is that whenever they deal in any business, they have no conscience about the quality of goods they deliver. So remember in Prohibition, the quality of the liquor you got from your bootlegger. The illicit whores. Who is to say they don't have venereal disease? Illicit gambling. Well, obviously the house always cheats. And the one-armed bandits rob you and don't give you a fair chance. Everything controlled by the mafia becomes crooked through and through. So naturally then, if the mafia were to move into psychedelics, heaven only knows what we should get. And a lot of the reason for the fact that there are these terrible stories about people who have complications with LSD is that what they took was not simply LSD. People will cut the supply, just sell you sodium bicarbonate with a tiny bit of LSD. They do all sorts of things. Mix it with other drugs. So the solution, as I see it, is to bring the whole thing out right into the open, to encourage research on it, and I suppose at this present time, the maximum sort of control that ought to be imposed on it is to make it something prescribable by doctors. Now, this isn't the ideal form of control, but it's a practical one. And then, in places like major university campuses, have LSD research centers or psychedelic research centers, where anybody who wanted this kind of experience could simply apply. And there would be facilities for experiencing it in a helpful environment. Because when young people get adventurous, what they need is not police and prohibitions, they need help. They need the best information and the best guidance that's possibly available to do a dangerous thing. When someone wants to go to learn to fly an airplane, all right, he could apply, and it needs a license, but he gets the best advice possible. All right, you want to be an astronaut of inner space? Well, you could go to school for it. And I visualize the possibility of psychedelic museums, where you would have a gorgeous set of buildings in lovely grounds, gardens, or by the sea. And it would be equipped with a big library of art books, with reproductions of all kinds of masterpieces from the whole world. There would be a collection of tapes and records with beautiful sound systems. There would be glass cases full of objects like seashells, crystals, ferns. There would be a conservatory with plants of all kinds, growing. And equipped in this way, then, if you wanted to take it, you would go in for a 3-day session. The first day would be for getting relaxed and for learning something about the properties of it, getting an idea of the map before you went into the territory. The second day would be to take the chemical and do anything, work on any problem you wanted to, because it is peculiarly suitable for working on some particular problem. There's a book by Stafford and Golightly called LSD, the Problem-Solving Drug. And there are ever so many case histories in that of engineers, architects, musicians, and so on, who had specific problems to solve and who used this for doing it. So that would be the second day. Then the third day would be for evaluation. Because after you've been through an LSD experience, you need a good day's rest to get back into the swing of things, but to think it over, to write about it, or to do something about it. Supposing you had seen a particular image that you wanted to preserve, well, on the third day you could paint it out, or draw it out, or write it out, or whatever you wanted to do. And the existence of such places, then, would put the use above board, out in the open, and not something that is simply done in an illegal situation. You see, one of the problems with most psychedelics is that they do tend to foster paranoia. And if a situation is illegal, you can get all sorts of ridiculous paranoid fantasies, as that your best friend is a representative of the police. And you can see every reason why he really should be. Because the capacity of these chemicals is that you have an enormous power of projection. You can see... you know how in the ordinary way you might be looking at this sort of wall here, which has got irregular paint patterns on it. Well, you can sit here and just in a perfectly ordinary state of consciousness and see pictures in it. And you can see trees and people and all sorts of things. Leonardo da Vinci used to make a regular practice of looking at a dirty old wall and find paintings in it. That's, of course, how we believe many of the great cave paintings were done, is that those people looked in the marks on the rocks and saw buffaloes and deer, and just followed the markings on the rocks, and for that reason created images of animals that were astoundingly accurate and realistic. Because if you use eidetic thinking, you'll do that. I remember one night I was out here and I was walking by the window, and there was I usually keep that table here. And I looked in the window, and to my astonishment, I saw a man sitting at the table on this side facing the window. I was looking at the reflection in the window. A rather scholarly-looking gentleman with a little imperial beard, resting his head on his hand like this and reading a book. There he was, right there. And I analyzed that for a while, and I could see exactly what was going on. There were things in the fireplace, paper and stuff, that built themselves perfectly into this image. So then you can see these things. People, for example, who hear voices. I've got a theory about this, and I believe it's correct. Naturally, in any place, there are all sorts of noises going around you. Sound of water in pipes, the sound of a gas heater, sound of people working in the distance, sound of the wind. And you can project meaningful voices and sequences of ideas onto these sounds and actually hear voices. So if you check with someone else and say, now look, I hear a voice talking, or I see a picture on the wall, or I see a vision, do you see it? And at first they say no. But if you then actually understand that you are projecting, you can point out to them where you see it. And they will say, oh yes, I see how you see that. But of course it isn't there in the ordinary sense. So with the psychedelic chemical, you have a tremendous power of projection. Your power of projection is increased 100-fold. And in fact, you can play games with it. You can take anything and turn it into practically anything else by looking carefully enough. And you'll find out a reason for turning it that way. I play this game quite deliberately now, in the ordinary state of consciousness. I play projections and see shapes just in anything. It's wonderful what you can do. And especially if you take something a bit chaotic, like a Rorschach plot or a dirty old wall or whatever you want, you can have an infinite fun seeing images in it. But the problem then is, if there is an unconscious reason for seeing certain images, if you're afraid, if you're mistrustful, or anything like that, you can see in a human life situation, say your relationship to your family, you can see a pattern of relationship which is absolutely misleading. And you can see the best reasons why it is this sinister situation. And then you're in trouble. So when, therefore, the use of LSD is totally illegal and people take it, they tend, because they are scared of what they're doing, to have the paranoid reaction altogether reinforced, and so naturally the illegality, the reasons that the government puts forward for making it illegal are of the nature of a self-fulfilling prophecy. By making it illegal, they make it harmful. Then they can say, look at all these harmful results. That's why it's illegal. But it's harmful because it's illegal. Partly. It can also be harmful simply through ordinary misuse. But I think our answer is to bring the whole question right out into the open and to deal with it as a fact that exists, that cannot be suppressed, that should not be suppressed, and try to control it. Because, you see, it's only one step, one link in a long, long, vast process of scientific work, which is, as I said earlier, once you've started to interfere with the world, you can't stop. And man, as many, many scientists now say, is no longer passively undergoing an evolutionary process. He's involved in it. And therefore we are reaching out to try and control ourselves, our brains, our nervous systems, by surgery, by electrical stimulation, by chemicals, all sorts of things we're using to try and find out how we tick. And I suppose we've got to go on and go on and go on doing that until we, for some reason, can call a halt and see that we don't need to do it anymore. But you see, LSD and psychedelics are just a part of this whole thing. And it has to be faced. But one final word. It is not something, and none of these things are understandable and controllable from what we might call a purely scientific point of view. Because the mumbo-jumbo of the purely scientific approach is in itself a kind of game. Involved in many sciences is the myth that situations can be observed objectively. And therefore scientists make a special effort, as it were, to be very serious and very analytic about certain situations, which is often quite right. But when you come into an LSD situation and you're investigating someone on its influence, and you come in with your scientific pomposity, he immediately sees that you're a freak. And quite asinine. And so it gives a rather bad impression. In a hospital, for example, hospitals are a big game. And the disciplines and the routines and the things that go on in hospitals, they do an enormous amount of things that are simply precautions against possible legal action in the future. And so now in any hospital, the doctors and the nurses have a great deal of difficulty doing their business because they keep filling out papers. Hours and hours and hours of paperwork goes on so that the record is straight. Soon they won't treat people at all. They'll just record all sorts of things, and just make records. They don't have to do anything. They just record something that didn't happen at all, so long as the records are straight. And it's getting that bad. It's getting that bad in universities. Happens that way too. So, in those environments, a psychedelic experience can get very, very queer and frightening. So, the question is, what sort of people are qualified to investigate LSD? And the answer is, at present, in a way, no one. And in another way, I would say simply those who've had a great deal of experience with it. You might say, certainly psychiatrists aren't qualified, least of all, practically. Because psychiatrists tend to be very scared of any kind of irregular reality. They're guardians of what we call sanity, of the way the world is on a bleak Monday morning. And they're frightened, very frightened of the unconscious, especially psychoanalysts. They always speak about the unconscious with a hushed voice. And you mustn't go fishing in the unconscious. It's a very dangerous field. Only a qualified person should investigate the unconscious. Because the unconscious is the big, mad sink, of the primordial slime out of which life issues serpents and menacing dragons. So perhaps a psychiatrist has some disciplines that might help with using psychedelics, but there should be generally, it needs the wisdom of a psychologist, of a pharmacologist, of an anthropologist, of a specialist in the psychology of religion, of a mythologist, of a poet, a painter, and you would have, in other words, in my psychedelic museums, you would have to have a team of people with all sorts of knowledge to combine somehow the sort of skill that is necessary for understanding psychedelics. As I say, though, the best people are really those who are most familiar with the territory. Like, you may be a specialist in mining, and you may know all about mining, but to get into a certain territory, what you need is an Indian guide. He'll show you how to get in and how to get out, although he knows nothing about mining. And it may be that in the investigation of LSD, it would be a great deal of help to know a lot about neurology. But the neurologist needs an Indian guide. And the Indian guide is the person who's been in the place quite often, knows his way around. And if you have taken LSD many times, you begin to know your way around. The landscape becomes familiar. You know all the different states of consciousness. And so LSD people begin to formulate their own lingo. They know a state called the plastic doll. They know a state called the magic theater. They know a state called, I call it the eeny weeny. They know a state called the great white light. They know a state of the wiggles, where the walls seem to breathe. And if you look at a flower, it's all rippling as if it were underwater. See, they know all these things. They know the state of paranoia, of getting lost, of wondering whether you can get back. And because they're familiar with them all, nobody gets frightened. And psychiatrists, if they are to be effective as psychiatrists, should be people who are familiar with all kinds of states of consciousness. And they should work, if somebody is way out of his head, he should be able to consult a person who knows exactly where he is and can come in and be quite familiar with that state, so that he can say, oh yeah, I know where you are. I've been there myself. And it's like this, But as it is, you see, psychiatry is not really exploring the mind. It is trying to stand outside and understand psychiatric problems through looking at patients and writing down their symptoms without really knowing anything about it. And therefore all the terms that are used in psychiatry to describe symptomatology are completely unscientific. They have no scientific spectrum of consciousness and all its possibilities at all. There is no such idea. You could write a textbook called The Spectrum of Consciousness, and you could, with quotations from literature and photographs and so on, illustrate almost all the known states of consciousness of which man is capable. But nobody has done such a project. And that would be basic reading for anybody who expected to be proficient in psychology or psychiatry. So these things have to be done. And without fear, but with these chemicals, in other words, are not something to be afraid of. They are simply something to be respected and handled with reasonable care, out in the open, and not in sort of a dingy pad or in the back of a car.